Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. We are starting at 4 p.m. Good? Awesome.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Judy Russell, the Dean of University Libraries here at the University of Florida, and I'm honored to welcome you today to the second Michael Gannon Lecture, and I'm extending a warm welcome as well to everyone watching on the live stream. This event is hosted by the Smathers Libraries, which are proud to be the custodians of Michael Gannon's papers and to be the beneficiaries of many years of his friendship and partnership. This lecture is co-sponsored by the History Department and the Center for Latin American Studies, and we're grateful for their collaboration. We're privileged to have with us a number of special guests, but I want to acknowledge specifically the 11th President of the University of Florida, Bernie Machen, and his wife, Chris. Bernie had the privilege of knowing and working with Michael Gannon throughout his presidency. President Fox was not able to join us today because of a Board of Trustees meeting, but he sends his greetings. We're most honored to have with us today Gigi Haugen Gannon, the widow of Michael Gannon. Gigi, would you stand and say hello? Also with us is Jim Cusick, the curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History and of the Michael Gannon Papers. I saw Jim a moment ago. Oh, there he is, waving from the back. He prepared the biography of Michael Gannon that's included in your program. It was about 5 years ago that Professor Gannon passed away at the age of 89. He's remembered for his path-breaking scholarship on Spanish history of Florida, his many books, and his excellence as a scholar, teacher, mentor, and mediator. The words about Michael Gannon that are most often quoted occurred shortly after his death at a university memorial service when his colleague in the UF History Department, Professor Steve Knoll, called Mike Gannon the conscience of the university. Steve is also here with us today. Steve, would you stand or wave? By one tally, Professor Gannon taught over 16,000 students in his 37 years on the faculty. He authored and edited a dozen books, and through his meticulous and fearless scholarship, vastly increased our understanding and appreciation of the earliest years of Spanish Florida. But his teaching and scholarship, while exceptional, were not the reason that he was the conscience of the university. Professor Gannon gained that unique stature by following his inner voice to lead the university and the university community in directions he knew in his heart to be right. At the inaugural lecture last year, President Kent Fox said, "If we're honest, he sometimes had to cajole, pull, and yank the university in the right direction, but we got there." His moral clarity, his inner voice, his heart were deeply rooted in his faith. He was a priest before he was a professor. In fact, one of his early assignments after being ordained in 1959 was to lead the St. Augustine Catholic Church and Student Center here in Gainesville. He spent years in that role, joining the UF faculty in history and religion in 1967 during the height of the Vietnam War. Professor Gannon quickly became the intermediary between angry students, the UF administration, and the police. Because of him, tensions were diffused and serious violence was prevented. He spent the ensuing decades mentoring generations of faculty and students, advocating for civil rights, mediating disagreements and advancing unity, and deploying his wisdom and beautiful voice at moments when literally nothing else would do. Though it's been more than 20 years since 9/11, people here still talk about the solace they felt when Professor Gannon spoke at the university memorial service after the attacks. In considering his legacy, it's important that Professor Gannon was a student of history. His knowledge of history, joined with his compassion, surely helped to form his inner being and outer presence, described with such elegance by Professor Knoll as the conscience of the university. So it's very appropriate that for this second Michael Gannon Lecture, we feature another exceptional historian, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Ada Ferrer. She will be introduced by her friend and colleague, Professor Lillian Guerra, Professor of Cuban and Caribbean History here at UF. Lily?
It is truly an honor to be here to introduce Ada Ferrer. Ada Ferrer is Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University, where she has taught since 1995. She is the author of Cuba, An American History, which won the 2022 Pulitzer Prize in History, as well as the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History. In 2014, she published Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution, winner of the Frederick Douglass Book Prize granted by the Gilder Lerner Center at Yale University, the Haiti Illumination Prize by the Haitian Studies Association, and 3 prizes from the American Historical Association: the Friedrich Katz Prize for the Best Book in Latin American History, the James A. Raleigh Prize for the Best Book in Atlantic World History, and the Wesley Logan Prize for the Best Book in African Diaspora History. It's when we say, wow. Unique in many ways, Freedom's Mirror relocates the origins of late 18th and 19th century thought on the universal human right to freedom from Europe to the leadership and struggle of Black Caribbeans, particularly the self-freed, once enslaved leaders and people of Haiti. She shows how their intellectual protagonism and political centrality to conceptions of modernity and revolution proved as anathema to the power and hegemony of most Europeans and most white Americans accepted histories that posited themselves as the principal authors of freedom. Yet for many historians of Cuba like myself, Ada Ferrer's first book, Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution, 1868 to 1898, published in 1999, remains her most important. It won the Berkshire Book Prize for the best first book by a woman in any field of history, but what makes its legacy undeniable were its many pioneering qualities and its legacies in people like myself and my students. Insurgent Cuba relied on never-before-used and long-suppressed documents, mostly from the Cuban National Archive, to show that most white Cubans' first espousal of anti-racism in the 30-year struggle for independence from Spain had largely served as a surrogate for true belief in Black Cubans' equality. Anti-racism, she showed, while a good rallying cry, did not evince a genuine commitment to ensuring racial equality through Black enfranchisement and leadership. What Ferrer demonstrated for the period of 1868 to 1899 was taboo, politically and otherwise, especially in Cuba, but among Cubans everywhere. This book was deeply empowering to all of us, like all of her writing. Ferrer's work has appeared in The New Yorker, Washington Post, The Hill, Huffington Post, Letras Libres, which is like the New Yorker of Mexico, and the American Historical Review. The list of prestigious national fellowships she has held includes those awarded by the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Social Science Research Council, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. In 2022, Ferrer was elected to the Society of American Historians at Columbia University. Born in Cuba and raised in the United States, Ferrer has been traveling to the island regularly since 1990. Please join me in welcoming Ada Ferrer.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you in this wonderful library that I've heard about for so long, but had actually never stepped in before, so it's a privilege. Before I begin, I'd like to thank a few people. My thanks, of course, to Michael Gannon's widow, Gigi Haugen, who has made this possible, and to Judy Russell, Dean of the Libraries, for everything she's done to get me here, to all the other organizers at the library, to the Departments of History and the Center for Latin American Studies. I thank you for your sponsorship, and for all of you for taking time out of your schedule on this Tuesday afternoon to come here, to come be with me here today. So I was asked by Judy and Lily to talk about my most recent book, Cuba and American History. It is not as easy or straightforward a task for me as you might imagine. How can I distill a book that is based on over 30 years of research, that took me 5 years to write, that stretches 560 pages, that covers more than 500 years of history into a tight, neat little package of about 45 minutes. It's not an easy task. There's no perfect or obvious way to do that. So what I've chosen to do here today is a kind of extended meditation on one part of the book. And that part of the book is the title, Cuba and American History. It is perhaps something of a mysterious title. People might read it and wonder, what does that mean? Is this book a history of U.S.-Cuban diplomatic relations? It isn't. Is it a history of Cuba told in the context of America, meaning the hemisphere, North and South? It isn't really that either. Put most simply, the book is a history of Cuba. It's a history of Cuba for over 500 years. But it is a history of Cuba that pays particular, if not exclusive, attention to the thorny entanglements between Cuba and the United States. It begins from the premise that to tell a history of Cuba can also serve to tell a kind of history of the United States itself, that it can serve to tell a kind of shadow history of the U.S., a necessarily selective, incomplete history of the United States, reimagined from Cuban ground and Cuban waters. So my lecture this afternoon or tonight, I'm not sure quite what it is in Gainesville. That's, time is a cultural artifact. But so my lecture this afternoon or tonight is an extended 5-part answer to the question of how this particular history of Cuba, my history of Cuba, can also serve as an American history. For each answer that I give, I'm going to draw directly from the book, hoping not just to reflect on the title, but also to give you a sense of the way I conceive of and the way I narrate an epic 500-year history on what I think of as a human scale, even an intimate scale. So to begin my first answer, I'll take up the very question of entanglements, the entanglements between the two countries. The first reason I chose to title the book and subtitle the book An American History is to highlight the breadth, the depth, and the complexity of the connections between the two countries over a very long period of time. Those connections stretch back over centuries, and importantly, they encompass more than governments, and they run in both directions. Few Americans, for instance, have likely considered the significance of Cuba for the United States. During the American Revolution, Cubans raised funds in support of Washington's army. As the 13 colonies lost access to other British colonies, other British possessions, Cuba became a vital trading partner, always in the top 3 of U.S. trading partners through the middle of the 19th century. Havana's storehouse of coveted silver helped finance the new United States' first national bank, first central bank. In the decades following American independence, many leaders of the young American Republic imagined Cuba becoming an integral part of the United States. In 1809, for instance, Thomas Jefferson expressed his desire that the borders of the U.S. reach all the way from Canada to the southern coast of Cuba. In 1823, he still believed that, arguing that, quote, Cuba is exactly what is wanting to round out our power as a nation. Cuba, he said, will fill up the measure of our political well-being, he wrote elsewhere. John Quincy Adams, for his part, prophesied that Cuba becoming American was as inevitable as a ripe apple falling from a tree. Later, in the 1840s, after Texas became an American state, Southerners and even some Northerners sought to annex Cuba to the United States, as one or two or even three slave states in order to buttress the power of slavery in the American Union. Then, in 1898, U.S. intervention in Cuba's independence war against Spain resulted in the event that many call the Spanish-American War. That war, which Cubans call by a different name, helped produce two very important developments in U.S. history. First, the reconciliation of North and South after decades of disunion, and second, the emergence of the U.S. as an imperial power on the world stage. Of course, the U.S. loomed large over the birth of Cuba as well. Cubans had fought for their independence for over 3 wars and 3 decades, beginning in 1868. But independence was achieved only after the U.S. intervened in 1898 and won the Spanish-American War. The end of 400 years of Spanish rule was ritually observed on January 1st, 1899, when at exactly noon, every Spanish flag on the island was lowered, but the flag that was raised in its place was not a Cuban flag, but an American one. With that began a full-fledged U.S. military occupation that ended 4 years later, but only after Cuban leaders, under enormous pressure, agreed to grant the U.S. government the right of intervention in Cuba. Alongside that history, my apologies for the sun. Anyway, alongside that history of government relations, there existed dense networks of human contact forged over decades by people of all kinds in both countries. Cuba's flag was designed and flown for the first time by Cuban exiles in the United States decades earlier. The first pro-independence newspaper was published in Philadelphia. The first national novel was written in New York. And Cuba's most famous patriot and writer, José Martí, spent more of his adult life in the United States than in Cuba. Cubans traveled to the US to study at Harvard and Tuskegee, to shop in Miami and play baseball in the American Negro Leagues, to escape dictators, and to view the famous falls at Niagara. Americans traveled in the other direction, to drink during Prohibition, to buy land and cigars, to convert people to Protestantism, to forge networks of Black solidarity, to honeymoon and to fish, to hear jazz, and even to get abortions. Americans listened to Cuban music, and Cubans watched American movies. Americans bought Cuban sugar, and Cubans bought American appliances. Actually, Cubans bought just about everything, except for sugar, from the US. And then all that changed. Not overnight, exactly, but almost. The exigencies of the Cold War meant that for decades, Americans understood Cuba as primarily a small, dangerously proximate satellite of the Soviet Union. Yet, its role in that global Cold War conflict notwithstanding, the revolution of 1959 cannot only be understood within a Cold War framework. The Cuban Revolution was not one thing. It changed over time in goals and methods. Before taking power, it was emphatically not communist, nor particularly anti-American. Cubans initially supported it, not because they desired to live under socialism or at near war with the United States. Yet the revolution produced both those outcomes in relatively quick succession. What explains how that happened is less the context of the Cold War than the revolution's relationship to history. So understanding that history, fascinating on its own terms and intriguing in its thorny entanglements with the United States, is therefore vital. And this long-standing interconnectedness that I narrate over the whole book and that I've narrated here in about 5 minutes is one reason why I chose to subtitle the book Cuba in American History, because the two countries were so intimately interconnected. Okay, now the second reason. Amid the connections that I've outlined, whether between governments or people in the dense back and forth between the two countries, there is a deeper, more sustained relation that I'd like to call attention to. The U.S. was present in Cuba in many and important ways. For example, this is just to name a few major examples, it dominated historically the Cuban sugar industry. It was present as a powerful ally that sometimes shaped the conduct of the Cuban state and of Cuban politics. Arguably, the United States was centrally involved, implicated even, in the institution that lay at the very heart of colonial Cuban history. And that institution was slavery. Slavery had existed in Cuba since the first days of Spanish rule, but it became the backbone of the economy at the turn of the 19th century. And by the late 1820s, Cuba was the largest sugar producer in the world. I've devoted much of my career to understanding Cuban slavery. It is in many ways the subject of my first two books, which Professor Guerra mentioned up here. But as I was researching this book, I was still surprised to realize how very intimate Americans' involvement with Cuban slavery could be. And to help me illustrate the depth of those connections, I want to share with you now the opening of one of my chapters on slavery, which recounts one of the most surprising things that I discovered in my journey to write this book. And what I'm just gonna read a little bit now from the beginning of chapter 9 of the book, which is called Dreams of Dominion, okay? It was the worst inauguration in the history of the United States. The new president looked despondent as he stood alone to take his oath of office. His 11-year-old son had died in a train accident on the campaign trail 2 months earlier. His wife, now the First Lady, refused to attend the inauguration. She was angry at her husband for having accepted the nomination and suffering from severe depression after having witnessed their son's death. Maybe as a concession to her, maybe because of his own pain, the president had canceled the traditional inaugural ball. Even the weather refused to cooperate. As he delivered his inaugural address, a heavy snow began to fall. We do not know then with how much energy or conviction the new president delivered the most saber-rattling words of his speech. Quote, "The policy of my administration will not be controlled by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion. Indeed, our attitude as a nation and our position on the globe render the acquisition of certain possessions eminently important for our protection." End quote. Everybody knew he was talking about Cuba. It wasn't just the weather and family travails that weighed on President Franklin Pierce that cold inauguration morning of March 1853. Divisions over slavery and uncertainty over the future of the Union cast a long shadow over the event as well. Pierce, a Northerner, had appealed to Southerners because he rejected the abolition of slavery and advocated territorial expansion. His vice president was William Rufus King, a wealthy cotton planter from Alabama whose family held some 500 people in slavery. He was seen as a moderate in those times, a fierce defender of slavery who also excoriated the militant slaveholders flirting with secession. In 1853 then, the combination of Northern Pierce and Southern King was supposed to embody moderation in the era's most pressing questions. But because this was the worst inauguration in living memory, it somehow made sense that the vice president was not there to embody moderation or anything else. He was instead a world away on a palatial sugar estate in rural Cuba, exhausted from the campaign and dying of tuberculosis. So that's the beginning of one of my chapters on slavery, and I want to just talk about it a little bit to illustrate how I think of that a history of Cuba can also provide such important windows into U.S. history. Now, you might be asking yourself why a new U.S. vice president was in Cuba instead of Washington taking his oath of office. The simplest answer is that he was in Cuba to recover from tuberculosis. For that, doctors at the time, in the mid-19th century, recommended something called the sugar cure, where people were supposed to go to the Cuban countryside, breathe in its salubrious air. They were supposed to spend time in an active sugar mill, and the idea was that the heat and vapors from the processing of the sugar, the boiling of the sugar, were supposed to work their wonder and somehow cure the malady. Now, you probably won't be surprised to hear that the sugar cure did not work. King died a few days, so he actually ended up taking his oath of office on the plantation, the only person ever to receive permission from Congress to be sworn in on foreign territory, but he died a few days after taking his oath of office, which he took on the highest peak of the plantation. It was the middle of harvest season, so he would have been overlooking men and women bent over the tall stalks of cane and seeing the chimneys blowing their smoke uninterruptedly. Now, even if the sugar cure makes no sense at all, I think that there are other ways in which the vice president's presence in Cuba was completely logical. And that is that Pierce and King had run their campaign, among other things, on a platform that aimed to make Cuba part of the United States. In the victory march the day after the election, supporters had carried banners that read Pierce and Cuba. So having Vice President King take his oath of office on a Cuban sugar plantation, in a sense, marked the island as imminent American territory. It is also important that King chose to take his sugar cure and his oath of office in the Cuban province of Matanzas, which was then the booming center of sugar production. It was also home to many American-owned plantations, and it had been for decades. The plantation on which he took his oath of office was owned by an American family. And of course, that was not the only one. To cite a few examples, the family of a Rhode Island senator and slave trader named James DeWolf owned multiple plantations in the region. New England men cleared the forest for the construction of the mills. They managed the production and sale of sugar. They bought and sold people. They separated families and meted out punishments. Senator DeWolf's nephew, who managed another one of the family plantations, allowed neighboring slaveholders to use the DeWolf stocks, the wooden torture instruments. He lent out his plantation stocks to others to punish their slaves. And at night on the DeWolf plantations, enslaved people used the light of glowworms to serve them as candles. The U.S., its citizens, its politicians, can sometimes be found at the very heart of the institution of Cuban slavery. What is more, profits from slave-grown sugar appeared in sometimes expected and unexpected places in the U.S. They were invested in industries such as coal, iron, manufacturing, railroads, and banking. The most famous example here is a man by the name of Moses Taylor, a New York sugar broker who made his early fortune in what everyone called the Cuba trade, and then invested it in banking and industry. Within a few decades, he was president of the National City Bank of New York, precursor to today's Citibank. Meanwhile, the account books from one of the Cuban plantations that belonged to Senator DeWolf's family revealed that profits from that estate served as the basis for a modest monthly stipend sent back to the beloved St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Bristol, Rhode Island. So Cuban sugar profits could be, you might find it in the most unexpected places sometimes in the United States. Okay. And so I think beginning a chapter on Cuban slavery, and I've done a lot of work on Cuban slavery, as Lillian knows, and there's several chapters on Cuban slavery, but beginning one with an American inauguration kind of puts the U.S. at the center of the story and highlights its pivotal role in it. So I wanted to just point that out, okay? Now, the third part of my answer as to how the history of Cuba can also serve as a kind of American history asks us to reconsider the way we think about the history of the U.S. in the world. Historians of U.S. foreign policy are used to thinking about American power exerted on a world stage. That is undeniable. But the world is a complex place, and the history and actions of its people can exert their own sway on the course of U.S.-directed events. When U.S. power, U.S. policy, U.S. governments operate abroad, they don't simply operate in empty space. The complex history of those other parts of the world shape the very exercise of U.S. power. So to illustrate this, I will draw on another extended example from the book. I won't tell you what it's about, but I think you'll be able to figure it out pretty soon. It's in the 20th century, just to give you a hint, okay? So this I'm reading from the beginning of chapter 27, I believe. So, yeah, 27. Geography had given the place a remarkable resistance to change. Located about 85 miles and worlds away from Havana, the vast Zapata Peninsula houses living species as old as the brontosaurus and pterodactyls. Reeds rise up from a vast expanse of thick water, underneath which lies a dense, tangled forest of hardwood timber, many thousands of years old. In the rivers and lakes of the peninsula still swims the Cuban gar, a species so old and unchanged that scientists categorize it as a living fossil. A rare species of Cuban nightingale sings the same melody its predecessor sang eons ago. Much of the swamp extends into the Caribbean Sea, but in a few places it gives way to a strip of solid sandy ground. Along parts of the coast is also a large shelf of dog's teeth rock, so named for the hard, jagged limestone that made the area inhospitable even after humans had begun to put shoes on draft animals. Near the eastern end of the vast wetlands is an inlet. Like the swamp, this bay boasts ancient species. Among them, the reef dweller that probably gave the bay its name, the queen triggerfish, known in Cuba as cochinos, or pigs. Humans arrived much later and gave names to those places and those species. Generations of Taino Indians made their home in this unusual terrain, burying their dead, feet always to the west, under mounds that alternated black earth and snail shells. In 1493, Columbus hugged the coast of the swamp on his second voyage. A century later, pirates were said to hide their treasure there. And 2 centuries after that, slave traders would use this unwelcoming coast to land illegal cargoes of Africans, forced after their long, grueling voyage across the Atlantic to trek over the dog-teeth limestone in bare feet. But these illicit uses aside, the place was so inhospitable, so cut off from the rest of the island, that it was settled but sparsely, whether by Tainos or Spaniards or Africans or the descendants of any or all of these. The swamp was hardly arable, and there were no towns to speak of, so the people who did settle there worked hard to make a living. They harvested the swamp, using rudimentary tools and the weight of their own bodies to loosen the thick, gnarled roots from under a foot or more of thick water. They excavated small patches of earth, built fires in them, and burned the wood to make charcoal. That was their occupation, and that was the only industry, or the main industry in the area. There was one route in and out of the swamp, a narrow gauge railroad, Often covered with water and unusable, it left people who lived in the swamp cut off from the rest of the island for weeks at a time. It was here, in this swamp, that Fidel Castro arrived by helicopter on December 24, 1959, to celebrate his first Christmas in power. He arrived with beer, soda, and a pig and a half, and invited himself and his 13 companions to Christmas Eve dinner at the home of a resident charcoal worker. I remember, recalled the man later, Fidel said to me, "You're all going to see how buses from Havana are going to come here." I thought he was nuts, the man said. Yet by the following Christmas, a newly built highway into the swamp was facilitating the transformation of the whole area. There was a new and fully staffed general hospital, an aqueduct, an electric plant, and a telegraph. A new shopping center had clothing and craft stores, a pharmacy, a butcher, a barber shop, and a post office. And on the beautiful beach called Giron, surrounded by the poorest, most unusual countryside on the island, the government was building a new seaside resort. 153 fully furnished 1- and 2-bedroom cabins in a complex that would boast a swimming pool, cafeteria, cabaret, game room, and more. Construction on the resort started just a few weeks after Fidel Castro showed up for Christmas dinner, and the opening date was set for May 20th, 1961, the 99th anniversary of Cuban independence. Almost exactly 1 month before the scheduled opening of the resort, some 1,400 men, all but 2 of them Cuban, waited offshore from that coast, completely unaware of all this activity. They were there on orders of the U.S. to invade Cuba. They planned to link up with internal resistance movements, because those did exist and were quite important. They were there to link up with internal resistance movements, spark an anti-Castro rebellion, and secure a beachhead. 3 days in, a new provisional government would arrive from Miami. Once that happened, 1,400 men would proceed north from the beachhead, turn left, and march on Havana. Some expected things to go so well that Castro's government might fall even before the government arrived. If things went more slowly or the man ran into trouble, they would fade into the mountains, link up with insurgents there, and wage the kind of guerrilla war against the Cuban government that Fidel himself had done a few years earlier. The first to realize that things would not go as planned might have been the men of the underwater demolition team, motoring a small launch toward the beach that first night. Their job was to set up marker lights that would guide the vessels and their landing gear onto shore to disembark the brigade members and their materials. But as the frogmen approached the beach, they understood their job would not be that simple. The place, one of them remembered later, was lit up like Coney Island. And 50 yards from where they had intended to land, people were having a party. Floodlights were lighting up our landing point like daylight, he said. The invaders, so now this is, I'm paraphrasing, that was the end of the beginning of that chapter. The invaders, as you can probably guess by now, had inadvertently landed in the middle of the, or had almost landed in the middle of the seaside resort under construction. So, for me to begin this narration of the Bay of Pigs invasion in the swamp, with Cuban geography and Cuban history, with actual residents of the area, is to remind the reader that any discussion of that American failure has to encompass all that. No landing, no invasion ever occurs on an empty slate, or more literally, an empty beach. History and place cannot be willed away. U.S. power is projected outward, but it comes up against the real world people and real world places, whose history shapes the exercise of U.S. power and U.S. designs. Okay. Now, so this is, see, I'm kind of going quickly and just giving you little pieces of the book to, because maybe you'll buy it, and also because it's fun to, to do this for me. Anyway, part 4 of my answer of how Cuban history can reflect American history forces us to think about Cubans and the ways they are affected by U.S. policies. If the way I begin the narration of the Bay of Pigs stresses the importance of other places and people and their effects on U.S. policy, I begin my analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis that came little over a year later, doing the opposite, focusing on the way ordinary people in other places feel viscerally the effects of U.S. policy and global superpower policy more generally. Now, the missile crisis is usually narrated as a story of 13 days, starting when Kennedy learned of the Soviet missiles in Cuba to the day when Khrushchev agreed to withdraw them. I tell that story too, but I choose to frame it within another different, more Cuban story. Okay, so this is from chapter 28, which is the beginning of my missile crisis chapter. In the fall of year 3 of the Cuban Revolution, the world's eyes trained on the sleepy rural town of Santa Cruz de los Pinos, about 65 miles west of Havana. Men there wore traditional peasant hats. Their families cultivated small plots of land, tended pigs, chickens, and the occasional cow. Residents began to get suspicious when their little town was suddenly overrun with young Soviet soldiers. Earnest, homesick, and with minimal Spanish, they went into town to trade watches, soap, shoes, and belts for something called alcoholitis, a 90-proof rum that Cubans considered too strong to drink. They sought out Cuban girls and Cuban foods. They carved their names in the Cyrillic alphabet into trees and rocks to document their presence in this unremarkable hamlet in western Cuba. Rumors about their purpose there grew more ominous when the town, where most people still got around on foot, horse, carriage, and occasional station wagon taxis, suddenly began having traffic jams in the middle of the night. The ground shook with the passing of mammoth trucks, too large to maneuver around corners. A building that housed a shoe shop was partially demolished on the spot to allow for the truck's wide turns. At another corner, the column of a portico disappeared. Cuban soldiers motioned for residents to stay inside, but people peered through the wooden slats of their louvered windows, and what they saw puzzled them. Trucks with long beds covered with tarps, and under the tarps, objects that looked like the trunks of very large palm trees. Residents of Santa Cruz de los Pinos soon had something else to puzzle over. American airplanes flying low and loud over their town and neighboring countryside. Years later, people remembered those flights as vividly as they remembered the Soviet trucks and the Soviet soldiers. People cowered, assuming they would drop bombs. Even though they didn't, the flights confirmed the townspeople's sense that something sinister and threatening was afoot. They could feel the danger as a physical sensation, the ground vibrating under the weight of the heavy trucks, the wind kicking up below low-flying planes, feelings of pins and needles up and down their spines. On October 14th, 1962, a plane flying south to north over Santa Cruz de los Pinos revealed to the world what the villagers, craning for views between the slats of their windows, had not yet learned, that the tree-shaped items on the backs of the trucks were Soviet missiles. With a range of 1,400 miles, they could strike Miami, Washington, and New York. A nuclear warhead on each would pack 70 times more power than the US atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima. Subsequent flights spotted dozens of missiles scattered over 6 sites across the island, all pointing north in the direction of the United States. From one day to the next, the destruction of major American cities and the deaths of millions of US citizens on US territory seemed eminently possible. The people of Santa Cruz de los Pinos were both the first and the last to know. Now, by starting the chapter there in this little town, by bringing our attention to the island itself and to the way that ordinary Cubans lived that terrible moment in history is a way to write against the way the story is usually told, which is as a story, a bilateral story between two superpowers. If history is in part about superpower actions, it is also, I think, about the countless ordinary lives that are nested in history's sway. The large-scale events of history, conquest, revolution, war, missile crises, ripple through individual lives. And every one of those lives embodies and condenses the history that made it. And as history makes people, so do people make history, reworking it day by day, creating meaning of the world around them, often acting in ways that fit but awkwardly in the categories of epic, or for that matter, Cold War history. Now, my final meditation on the question of how this book, this history of Cuba, can also illuminate US history is actually a very personal answer. As I point out in the book's preface, I was born in Havana between 1961 and 1962, between the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis. My father was already in New York, having left the island a few months earlier. My mother and I followed 10 months after my birth. We left the house at 6 in the evening, and she chose that hour because my brother would be playing outside. She had not told him that we were leaving and that she was not taking him. At the airport, a woman in uniform put her fingers to my earlobes to feel their tiny gold-post earrings, as if about to take them, and then changed her mind. On arriving in Mexico, my mother had to rely on the kindness of a stranger to make it into the city. When we got to Jim Crow, Miami a few months later, my mother encountered an old acquaintance, helping officials assign newcomers to hotels by race. A few days later, after arriving in New York, I opened my arms to my waiting father as if I already knew him. These and other stories were my inherited memory of a departure that changed my life. After some initial moving around, Harlem, Brooklyn, Miami, we settled in West New York, New Jersey, a working-class community that was predominantly Cuban. On Saturdays, I wrote letters to my brother and grandmother in Cuba. On Sundays, I listened to our priest pray for the release of political prisoners on the island. Every September 8th, I walked in the procession to Cuba's patron saint, La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobre, or the Virgin of Charity, marching past buildings that bore anti-Castro graffiti. An absent presence, a present absence, Cuba was impossible to escape. The history of Cuba that I was driven to tell in this book is my family's history. It is my history, but I am here and I am American. And that leads me to wonder about the stories and histories that we all carry. In a country where so many people come from other places, from all over the world, often driven here by the unfolding of historical events, the history of Cuba, of Haiti, of El Salvador, of Ukraine, of Ethiopia, and of other innumerable places is always already present here. So in conclusion, if I were to take these multiple, they're not quite answers, but multiple reflections on why this book might be considered a window into American history, I would distill them all by saying something quite obvious. History always looks different depending on where one stands. Seen from Cuba, America looks different. Indeed, it is not even America, a name that Cubans, like many others across the world, use to name not the United States, but the two countries of the Western Hemisphere. Cuban history, meanwhile, is many things. One of those is a mirror to the history of the United States. This history of Cuba, then, serves, as I said, as a kind of shadow history of the US. And it constitutes ultimately an invitation for US readers to see their own country refracted through the eyes of another, from the outside in, much as I have lived and understood Cuba and the United States most of my life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was both inspiring and enlightening. And we do have time for questions, and Bridget and Jim are here on either side. Each has got a microphone with them, so if you have a question, if you would raise your hand or otherwise signal, and they'll bring a mic to you, and you can pose your questions.
Hello? Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ferrer, for, as you said, meditating with us. I think that was a beautiful analogy to use as we thought through these. And I just wanted to come back to a theme you ended on, the idea of history, because your talk reminded me of an Edward Said quote, that nations are narrations. And I thought about it the whole time you were speaking, the power of history to build states, but also to affect every person's life. And so I guess just I'd ask you just to talk a little bit about how you understand the history of Cuba in modern Cuba and in modern America, and the history, I guess, its implications for both the state, both states, but also the people in both countries, and what history as an idea, as well as a field, can sort of tell us about maybe the future relations between both countries.
Okay, well, what is my conception of history? Okay, so I think, sorry. So I would say that, in the beginning of the book, I quote that very, very famous Howard Zinn quote about that history should not be the memories of states, right? And the Cuban state, always, but in particular after 1959, has really marshaled history and a particular narrative of history that is very hard to write on the margins of. And so for me, part of what I want to do is write a history that to me feels first more peopled than those other histories, or where people is more than an abstraction, the people with a big P. I don't want to write history that way. So part of one of my responses to that is to write a history that is peopled with a little p, and also to write a history that just, because the way, and I think that kind of history that the state has championed is a kind of history where one identity leads to an automatic ideology, where things are just put in boxes. And that doesn't appeal to me at all. It never has. It has never felt real. It has never felt true. It has never felt genuine. And I think part of that actually comes again from this very personal place where I grew up among Cubans, most of whom were not educated, most of whom were working class, and who were virulently anti-revolutionary. So this idea that that one kind of person was a revolutionary and one kind of person was a counter-revolutionary it never reflected a reality I knew. So I think I just always resisted that kind of imposition. So I would say that. So part of me was to get away from thinking, to think on the margins of the state, I would say. Then the other thing, I do think that maybe because I think of history that way, I think that history, there's a special, I don't know if this is true, because history has become, right now is so politicized in the US that I know it's more complicated than this, but in the case of Cuba, I like to think that history, divorced from those state mandates, can be a place where a new kind of reconciliation can be imagined, right? It's a history that's so polarized, and And in the same way that I think of the book as something that Americans to read, to get, to see themselves through the eyes of another, right? Which is something that is necessary for any kind of reconciliation, right? I also think about Cuban readers, and if they could ever read it, because it's not in Spanish yet, but that for Cuban readers, I hope it gives them an opportunity to see history from the eyes of each other, right? So that they're not. So in a sense, it's this idea of just history as a human endeavor. I hope that answers your question, but that's where I'm at. Yeah. Okay, there was no microphone, but I think you all heard it. What is the future of Cuba? I wish so, I think anyone who gives a confident answer to that question probably, I would venture to say, doesn't know as much as they think they know that they're talking about. Because, if you think about the Obama years when there was a sense of opening and of new possibilities, I was there when Obama visited, and you had a sense that it's not that all problems were going to be solved, but you had a sense that something was shifting in the relationship and that something new might come out of it, and no one expected, what happened, before the end of the year, which was, the election of Donald Trump and the complete reverse, not the complete, but the near complete reversal of those policies. So no one could have expected that. Biden said that he was going to reverse the policies that most hurt the American policies that most hurt the Cuban people. That leaves aside Cuban government policies that hurt the Cuban people, but Biden doesn't control those, right? But Biden had said he was going to reverse U.S. policies that did most damage to Cubans. But, he came in after the January 6th Capitol. He came in the middle of COVID. So with so much going on, it clearly wasn't a priority. So he hasn't done that. He's begun to do smaller things, and some things are moving in a direction that's a little more open now. But again, part of what has forced Biden to do that is less maybe his initial intention to do that than the fact that there has been over the last year so much illegal Cuban migration to the U.S. by way of the U.S.-Mexico border, so that you had almost 300,000 Cubans across the U.S.-Mexico border this past year. I think that's forced him to realize he has to do something about Cuba. And so that's something, so again, like it's too contingent. Things change, things happen that are unexpected, the COVID pandemic, the death of, things like that. That I wouldn't venture a prediction. I'm sorry, but it doesn't look good. I think it would be good if Biden pursued some of those more open policies. In terms of the Cuban side of that, the Cuban side of the equation, it doesn't look good at all. There's shortages like there haven't been in decades. Actually, I think the shortages now are worse than any during the special period, which is the period after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Cuban economy just plummeted. I think it's much worse now. Most young people in Cuba want to leave. There's no clear answer to what will improve the lives. Well, there's no sense that the Cuban government will pursue policies that will improve the lives of the majority of its people right now. So I'm not too optimistic, I would say.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I wrote down one of the things you said because it was so beautifully, the book is beautifully written. When you were talking about this sort of communist makeover of the Cuban Revolution by this very small group of people and the way in which everybody had to adjust to that, you said that what explains socialism and the war footing in which Cuba was placed was, quote, less the context of the Cold War than the revolution's relationship to history, which I thought was spectacular. And I wonder, because you have been a constant witness to Cuba since 1990, One of the biggest, perhaps, obstacles to being able to say the same thing today about how Cubans could understand the tumultuous things that they have experienced is the absence, really, of historical knowledge among most Cubans. For the first 30 years of the revolution, the teaching of history was ideologically driven, particularly in the 70s and 80s, when it was funded in part by the Soviet Union and the Institute of History and all this sort of effort. But then in the last 30 years, most people that I know, including historians, are pretty horrified about how episodic what is taught, how episodic it is, and how little young Cubans care, because they've sort of been saturated with so much politicization that they don't want to even know. And then when you actually start talking to them about history, they're often fascinated by their own history. So to end my question with a question, I wonder, last year, I've got one more factoid to throw in. Last year, 2022, the National Union of Historians awarded Raul Castro with the Historian of the Year award, which speaks, I think, in metaphors beyond comprehension, where we are in terms of so many things in Cuba. So how do you think, given this sort of landscape, how do you think those Cubans that you know, the people that live on the island, and historians themselves, how do you think that they would approach that same notion? How do they relate what's happening to them, all the sort of radical changes and shifts back and forth that have taken place since 2014 in the opening? How do they relate that to history, to their own history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure that they do. I think I agree with you that most people, especially most young people right now, are not that interested in Cuban history. I think precisely because they've been saturated with, those narratives have been just so all-encompassing that, in a sense, they feel like to engage in historical, a lot of them don't know what it is to engage in historical analysis. That's not to say that there aren't, wonderful historians there who do that, but I just mean in terms of the way that it's generally taught in high schools and so on. I don't think that's modeled for them particularly. One of the things that, it's interesting because if you go, I started going to Cuba to do research in 1990. So when I was there, a lot of the books that have been published in the 70s and 80s came out of that period that was very, where historical studies were very Soviet influenced. And if you turn to the back of a book and check the bibliography, the first citation would be to Marx, sometimes Lenin, and sometimes Fidel Castro, and then there would be an alphabetical bibliography, right? And it was just, and now Cuba has its own Wikipedia that's state-run, that's called Ecurred. Sometimes I look things up there, like I needed to find information on the small town, and I wanted to find information on this small town in the 20th century. There's nothing. It spends a lot of time on the a little time on indigenous, colonial, a lot of time in the wars of independence, because that is the major force of the major topic of a lot of historical studies there. And then it says, during the pseudo-republic, which is the term that's used, there was no development. And it's literally one sentence or two, and then there's a little bit of a narration of the revolutionary struggle in the 50s and beyond. And so I feel like we're back to that place that you're talking about of the 70s and 80s where it was hard. At the same time, I saw an interesting interview with one of the protesters who was arrested after the July 2021 protest, who was picked up and sent to jail with a lot of young people. This person was an intellectual, actually a playwright, and he was held briefly in jail with a lot of people who were just picked up, in the protest, so people who generally not educated. And he said the whole time they were held, he talked to them about Cuban history. And, I wish I knew more details of what he told them, but he did, he talked to them about, he said he did talk about Atuey. That was one detail he gave. This is an indigenous figure during the conquest. And so you just wonder if part of it is in the style of telling, in the tone of telling. There's a kind, right? the tone of telling, and the fact that it's told only as a story of heroes and villains. And one of the things when I was writing this book that I really wanted to make real was, I wanted to write a history that people like my parents, should they ever be able to read this book, which they weren't for many reasons, but would be able to see themselves in, right? And I have gotten messages from people who convey that kind of emotion. Like the closer I got to this period, the more I could see my grandfather, my mother, and I feel like if people could narrate history, if they could be exposed to history that wasn't so categorical and didn't hit you over the head with ideology all the time, it's a fascinating, rich, amazing history, which is why we study it, right? But that's not the way it's mostly taught or written, though there are some exceptions. Yeah. There's other.
I'm thinking of another book that you could write called Cuba, a Latin American History. And I wonder if you were to write that book, would it be as rich as the one that you wrote? And what would be the difference between those two books?
I think it could definitely be as rich. There wouldn't be as big a market for it in the US. That is for sure. But I would, for example, like the relationship between Cuba and Mexico is a fascinating one. Going back to I think actually you could. That's the one I think of the most, right? Well, Cuba, in some ways, my Cuba-Haiti book does that a little bit. I've only managed to do it with one country at a time. But the one with Mexico would be amazing because, it was Mexican silver that basically funded Havana and that filled its storehouses and that made Havana the envy of, this crossroads of the world for a particular period of time. And the early independent Mexican state also wanted to annex Cuba to Mexico, because in the same way the Americans saw Cuba as this natural appendage, Mexican statesmen use the exact same phrasing. There's a story of the involvement of Mexicans in Cuban independence. There's the story of Fidel Castro in Mexico, organizing the revolution of '59. I think it would be a great book for someone else to write. I'm not gonna write it, but like if there's graduate students here, if you're thinking, it wouldn't be a good dissertation, it's too big, but a good second or third book, I think it would be great. Yeah.
So I know it's not particularly difficult to get Cubans to start opening up about their experiences, but when you have a question that you want answered, in particular from the personal accounts of the individuals who experienced that history, where do you go and how do you begin asking those questions?
I think I try asking it in different ways. So I don't ask it like in one way. I come back to it whenever I can. I try asking rather than, I try asking very specific things that might jog their memory. So I try to do, I do that. I'm not an oral historian. I wish I had more experience doing that, but, like if I want to talk to them about, the early revolution or Fidel Castro, it's like, oh, where were you when you heard Batista had left? Or did you hear it on the radio? Or who was, I just try to kind of get them to focus on like really tangible things and kind of get them talking that way. But I'm sure, I think that's what I do. I think there are probably oral historians who have, much better tricks than that, but that's what I do. Yeah. And as you say, Cubans do like to talk, so it's not always that hard. Yeah.
Fantastic presentation. I am speaking like you as a compatriot because I was born in Cuba. And of all your meditations today, the ones that really got me was the one with the Zapata wetlands.
Yeah.
Wetlands are very significant, and I am very interested in that in general. But it was only recently that I started thinking about that because my family came in probably the second boat that was exchanged for the prisoners of the Bay of Pigs. And it's a very, very interesting story. And there is a choreographer here in town, Judy Skinner, from the, what is called, Dance Alive National Ballet. She's working on a piece that she actually produced 20 years ago, and it had to do primarily because she's Jewish descent. Her family came through Ellis Island, but she wanted to update it. And so she was looking for other people that would contribute to that, and that's where somehow she asked me, and I said, it's something that in a way I bury,
Yeah.
but I had to confront it. And there's many questions, but one of them is why do they call, and this is very prosaic, not profound, but why do they call it the Bay of Pigs? And you just told me it had to do with a fish,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Well, there's that. But anyway, I love that meditation because there were things I didn't know. I was always hearing the Playa de Girón and all of that, but it wasn't. It's really the wetland. How did they come in? Why did they fail? Mm-hmm. And you made it really a lot clearer to have a perspective a little bit different. Yeah. My perspective is different because I do remember getting on that one of those ships. I think it was the second one that came from Havana Harbor to Everglades. Mm-hmm. On February 13th and 14th. So I arrived in the United States on St. Valentine's Day.
What year? What year?
1963, the same year that Kennedy was killed. And
yeah, my mother and I almost came on one of those boats, so we might have almost come on that one. Was it?
Anyway,
yeah.
So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? All right, yeah. I had a question. You'd mentioned how you wanted to incorporate a personal component to your book.
Wait, sorry, I can't. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah.
All right.
No.
Hello?
Yes.
There we go. You mentioned that you wanted to incorporate a personal component into this book, and I was wondering if you could maybe speak about your journey, your struggles, whether with this book or even throughout your life, in terms of your identity being Cuban American. I'm first generation, born in Miami, but my parents were born in Cuba. So I kind of struggle is a strong word, but it's in between, right? Between being raised in a Cuban identity, but also being Americanized in a sense. And I'm curious as to what struggles or just your journey throughout this process in terms of learning more about the history and also kind of avoiding that politicization, I guess, of that history, when it's very difficult to maybe talk about that in a family sense as well, and just in a historical sense.
Yeah. Well, this is, as I said, at the very end, I grew up hearing about Cuba all the time. It was always there. A lot, as a teenager, you resisted. So my mother would say this, and I would say, we're not in Cuba anymore. So it's not like an easy relationship. I think there was part of me that resented the weight that I felt from it. And so I went away to college and I studied Victorian literature, and I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Walter Pater, a 19th century British literary critic. Nothing at all to do with Cuba. But then I also, started thinking, like, here, I'm from this place and I don't know anything about it. So I just kind of, I don't know. And I did, it's like, I don't know, graduating college is a very difficult thing because, all your life you've been in school, you've had a purpose, and then suddenly you're out and you have to decide what to do with your life. So I just said, I'll go back to school. But I felt like I couldn't justify getting another degree in Victorian literature. So I said, well, maybe I'll study Latin American history and maybe I'll be a journalist. I had no idea, I was just kind of feeling my way. So basically I turned this relationship with Cuba into it was always an emotional relationship, right? But I turned it also into an intellectual one. And but that meant that for a long time I had to, when I wrote about it only in that vein. So if I brought up anything personal, it was at the very end of the acknowledgments or something, right? And then, but as I was finishing this book, I just felt like, for one thing, it was a trade book, so I didn't feel some of the same constraints, but also that I was writing it, that it would be, I would somehow be doing a disservice to the reader to not say up front that this was my relationship to the topic. And so I just decided to make that part of it. And then also, to be quite honest, it was also that the final stages, the final stages of writing this book, especially the beginning from the part where I began drafting the part on the revolution, my parents were declining in health very rapidly. So actually helping to care for them overlapped with the writing of the book, and that brought this whole other personal dimension that made it much more, it made the personal dimension feel much more urgent. And so I just decided, this is how I'm going to do it, because this is what feels honest. But it's not like, but also it's not like you just figure out that relationship one day and then you figured it out and that's it. You know, like it's a long process that doesn't, I think, really end.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say outstanding lecture. Thank you very much. You said that it took you 5 years to write this very long book.
Which is very fast,
yeah.
By the way. For me, anyway, not for Lily. Yeah.
I was just wondering, could you walk us through a bit of your researching process to how you got all these in-depth interviews, all this very critical knowledge to be able to write this book, and like where do you even begin when you're trying to compile this massive history into a physical novel?
Yeah, I mean, I did this book very differently than my other books. You know, it's like the first book was my dissertation, which meant that I'd spent all this time in the archives, and then you write it as a dissertation with your advisors and professors, and you revise it, and so it's a very, my second book took me like 15 years to write. So, and then this book, I knew that I had less time. I didn't want to, my second book took me so long, I'm being way too honest here, the second book took me so long that I didn't want this book to take long. And so I knew I just had to work differently. But I was able to work differently in part because I wasn't coming to this as a novice. I had been traveling to Cuba since 1990, I'd been doing research for 30 years. So in some sense, I kind of could draw on all that. And then in terms of how to harness it, I just broke it down into little pieces. So it wasn't like, I wasn't going to, with all my other books, I completed most of the research and then wrote. You can't complete all the research on 500 years of history because you'd never finish. So I just did it, I did it chapter by chapter, and I kept the chapters short, and that just made it more manageable. But there's not one way to, there's not one way to write a dissertation. There's not one way to write a book. I would say the main thing is just to, keep sitting down over and over again, day after day. I would say that's the biggest, not so secret, yeah.
Cuba's history with slavery, both in terms of its duration, but especially its scale, dwarfs that of the United States. Yeah. I'm curious, how do Cubans reckon with that, and what lessons might Cuban discussions or discourse on that topic offer those same discussions taking place in the United States today, given those entanglements between the two countries that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for the most, Cuba was the major, Brazil was the major slave society of the 19th century, and Brazil received the bulk of Africans transported to the New World by force. So Brazil dwarfs every place. But in the 19th century, Cuba was especially after 1850, the major destination of the illegal slave trade. Because it was the world's largest producer of sugar, it was one of the places where slavery was most influential and powerful. I think the way that, what's interesting about the way, there's multiple ways to talk about slavery in Cuba. The way historians have talked about it, and here I'm talking mostly about with a few exceptions, U.S. historians working on Cuban slavery. They've written on the social history of slavery, slavery and tobacco, slavery, well, not so much tobacco, slavery and sugar, slavery and coffee, the slave family, women, rebellions has gotten a lot of attention. But the other way that it's talked about is in relation to the wars of independence, because the end of Cuban slavery coincided with the wars of independence. And that has made it really difficult, I think, because the wars of independence are such a politicized topic where the state narrative has so dominated that it makes it hard. It has impinged on Cubans' ability to write the history of slavery, in which certain slaveholders don't come out as heroes. I'll just leave it there. Yeah. There's a question.
Taking my question. You spoke at some length about the connection between slavery in the United States and slavery in Cuba. Well, after slavery in the United States, we had Jim Crow. Was there Jim Crow in Cuba? My sense is that there was, and that it really didn't end until the Cuban Revolution in 1959, but that may be wrong. Did Black Lives Matter did Black Lives Matter in Cuba before the revolution, and was there any improvement in Black Lives Mattering after the revolution?
Well, you know, there was racism in Cuba. There is no doubt about that. As Lillian said in her brief remarks on my first book, that racism existed in the colonial period, it existed in the Republican period, and it has continued to exist in the revolutionary period. There were lynchings in Cuba during the Republic, not on the scale of anything in the U.S. There was some segregation, but not, again, on the scale of the U.S. So, for example, you know, the town where my mother grew up had they had a little dance floor, and on there was a rope in the middle of the dance floor that was meant to separate black and white, but people could cross it. So it never functioned the way it did in the U.S. And I was going to say something else. Black Lives Matter. No, I mean, but there were Black Cuban activists who fought for civil rights. There were Black leaders of slave rebellions, but even after you're talking about after the end of slavery, there were Black civil rights leaders from the end of slavery through the Republican period. They mobilized. They wrote. They created organizations. They lobbied politicians. They ran for office. They voted, which is a huge difference. You know, there weren't poll taxes the way that there were in the U.S. and things like that. What happened after the revolution is there were Black activists who really believed that with the revolution in power, now was the time to really address the question of discrimination and racism. But the government never followed through on that. And so in 1962, Fidel Castro declared that the problem of race had been solved. And that made it very difficult to deal with the question of racism, because if you pointed out racism, that either meant that you were accusing Fidel Castro of lying, or that the revolution had failed. So there was very little public space for discussions of race and racism. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned the arrival to Jim Crow, Miami, earlier in your lecture, and I wanted to ask about sort of the, can you expand on what the experiences might have looked like for the Cuban arrivals, and also on the side of the Americans already living under Jim Crow?
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, if you read sources from the early 60s in Miami, one of the things that Black American civic leaders and political leaders in Miami would often point out was that when Cubans arrived in the U.S., that they, no matter their color, or mostly no matter their color, that they could identify as white. So so for example, Miami was a southern city. It was a Jim Crow city. So there were black beaches and there were white beaches. Cubans could go to either, right? Cubans went to white schools, right? Things like that. So black activists always pointed that out, that in a sense, assimilating to the U.S. was in part a process of whitening, right? But the other thing I want to, there was one other thing I wanted to, the other thing that's really important is that when Cubans were given advantages in the immigration system. So when Lyndon P. Johnson passed something called the Cuban Refugee Adjustment Act, Cubans were given credit towards nationality, right? They could apply for residency sooner, and they could then they could apply for citizenship sooner than anyone else could. What comes with citizenship? The right to vote. So in a sense, in the same moment that is the moment of black civil rights struggles over the vote, you have Cubans who are being fast-tracked to the vote while African Americans are fighting, decades and decades and decades of the denial of the vote. So I think it's important to put those two processes in conversation with each other. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello. So I had two questions, actually. So when you had mentioned earlier that, they're both quick. When you had mentioned earlier that you had spent so much time researching, when you were finding that personal component and having conversations with people, I know you said you weren't an oral historian, did you find that it was more difficult as time went on to find those personal connections as the population who had experienced like the Bay of Pigs and stuff like that were aging? And then was there a conversation or something that you had found in your research that you remember being the most poignant or most surprising to you?
The thing is, the people who experience those things, it did not get harder the closer I came, because there's so much printed material, right? There's all these memoirs, there's hundreds of thousands of pages of unclassified government documents that sometimes they capture some regular opinions and experiences as well. So I felt like the later the period went, I found too much material sometimes. So, and I forgot the second part of the question. Oh, surprising. Well, I still think that one of the most surprising things was finding out that a U.S. vice president took his oath of office on a Cuban sugar plantation. When I read that, I couldn't believe that. Reading the documents from the Bay of Pigs, I found also really surprising, because the planning was just so, unbelievably bad. Just things that you read and you think, wait a minute, they were supposed to fade into the mountains, but the mountains were nowhere near where they landed, right? Things like that. And you just read about those, you read the transcripts of those meetings and you're just left kind of speechless. And then most poignant, I think, there's a long chapter on the question of migration and Miami, and reading people's accounts of leaving, of first trips back, of not seeing people for decades and decades. It's, also because it's my family's own lived experience. I still think that the power of some of those narratives still not surprised me, but really touched me. I would say those three. Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you again, Ada, and thank you all for attending this year's Michael Gannon Lecture. If you're here in person, I hope you will take home the program that Jim prepared, which includes a biography of Michael Gannon with photographs. If you're attending virtually, we'll send you a link so you can download the program. The Michael Gannon Lecture Fund was established in 2019 to honor his life and work through an annual lecture by a significant scholar or notable speaker, and we've certainly lived up to that commitment today. The generosity of the donors have made it possible for us to bring Ada here today to speak with us. And we want to continue bringing high caliber speakers to campus annually through this lecture series. Family, friends, and admirers of Michael Gannon are helping us prepare for future lectures through charitable gifts to the libraries, and we're grateful for their support. If you enjoyed this program, or if you remember Michael Gannon as an outstanding teacher, scholar, and community advocate, please consider making a gift to support the Gannon Lectures. Instructions for making gifts are printed on the back of the program. I also wanted to call attention to the brochures that you received as you came in that describe our Cuban initiatives here in the libraries. They're extensive and quite interesting, and they reflect the collections that we're building here, many of which are digital and therefore available openly worldwide. Now, I hope you'll join us in the lobby for a book signing. If you wish to buy a book, there'll be copies available for sale, and if you brought one with you, please take it out to the table for signing. And thank you again so very much for coming, and thank you, Ada, for a wonderful program. We're so delighted that you're here. Thank you.